Hey guys, welcome to my channel Top Stitched. This video is a sewing tutorial for a pattern I recently created. It's an oversized mock neck t-shirt. The pattern is beginner friendly and a link to it will be down in the description box below. Before we get into the tutorial, let's start with some important information regarding the fabrics we'll be using. For this pattern, I am recommending you use either a jersey or a sweatshirt fabric for the body and the sleeves of the shirt, and then a rib knit for the neckband. In this tutorial, I will be using a cotton hemp jersey, and I will link the fabric I bought in the description box below, as well as a couple other fabrics I think would work great for this pattern. Jersey fabrics are fairly easy to work with, but there are a couple things you just want to keep in mind to ensure all your cutting is accurate. Since jersey fabrics tend to have a good amount of stretch to them, it's a good idea to not let them drape over the side of your cutting table, since this will potentially distort your fabric while you're cutting it. And then once it's cut, it'll like snap back and be smaller and just distorted compared to, the pattern piece and what you're wanting. And then, as with any fabric, you want to make sure that you're smoothing out any wrinkles by hand or with an iron if necessary. For this pattern, the front, back, and the sleeve pieces all call to be cut on the fold. If you do choose to cut on the fold, make sure you're planning out your fabric usage so there isn't an awkward amount of fabric left over. For example, if I were to simply fold this fabric I have in half and cut on the fold, I would be left with fabric on either side of the section I cut out that is too narrow for any of the other pattern pieces. To remedy this, you can fold over your fabric less than halfway. I have a couple pattern layout guides in the instruction PDF packet for reference. So my cutting table is wide enough that I can lay out my fabric completely flat, and personally I prefer to cut flat. So what I will be doing is tracing around one half of the pattern piece and then flipping it over to trace around the other half using a temporary fabric marker. Notice that I also marked down the middle of the pattern. This is so I have a guide to line up my pattern piece correctly when I am flipping it over, and it also acts as my middle notch marking that will help me line up the pattern pieces correctly when I start sewing them. Once I have completely outlined a pattern piece, I use my ruler to help cut the straight edges by lining the ruler up with the markings I just made. For the curves, I just take my time and cut along them, getting a smooth, even cut. For cutting the neckband out of the rib knit, I am first cutting open my fabric because this rib knit came in a tubular form and I don't care to cut on the fold. Make sure when you're cutting out the neckband pattern piece to notch or mark the center of the neckband where the triangle is. With that, we are done with the cutting. You should have 5 pattern pieces in total. This is a great time to take a break before we start sewing. So the first seam we will be sewing are the shoulder seams. Remember that in this pattern, all the seams are to be sewn with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, while the hems will be turned up 1 inch. Jersey fabrics don't fray, so I did not feel the need to serge the seam allowances for this pattern, but of course, if that's what you prefer, that's what you can do. With the right sides together, match up the shoulder armhole corner of the front and back pattern pieces. Straight stitch along the shoulder seam until you get to the neckline. Repeat for the other side of your garment. Next, I will be taking the seam allowance of the shoulder seam we just created and pressing it towards the back pattern piece. With the right side of the garment facing up, I will be top stitching the shoulder seam allowance to the back pattern piece, using that shoulder seam as a visual guide. I top stitched about 1/8 of an inch away from the shoulder seam. Repeat for the other shoulder seam. Next, we are going to attach the sleeves to the body of the shirt. If you are sizing down on the pattern or using a fabric with little to no stretch, you probably want to use either a zigzag stitch or a serger for this step instead of a straight stitch, as it will make the garment easier to get in and out of. There are a couple ways to sew a sleeve onto an armhole, and you can use whatever method you feel most comfortable with. Personally, I like to sew flat as much as possible, so I will be sewing the sleeves on now before sewing any side seams. With right sides together, I pin the center of one sleeve pattern piece to the shoulder seam. Then I line up and pin each side of the sleeve to the side seam of the front and back pattern pieces. You may notice that the curve of the sleeve pattern piece is slightly longer than the curve of the armhole. Evenly distribute this additional length along the armhole curve. Once distributed, pin halfway between the pins already placed for a total of 5 pins. Once you have done this, you're ready to sew the shoulder seam, starting with one edge and removing the pins as you go. Make sure that at the point the needle is piercing the fabric, that both layers are lining up with the 1/2 inch mark on your machine. Since these are curved pattern pieces, they will have a natural tendency to pull away or go past the 1/2 inch mark. The great thing about working with jersey and other stretch materials is that the stretch will allow you to manipulate the fabric more easily so you can stay right on the 1/2 inch mark. Pin and sew the other sleeve. The next thing we are going to sew are the side seams. Turn the shirt inside out so right sides are together. Align the front and back pattern pieces, making sure the armhole seam is matching. Press open the armhole seam and pin. Pin along the rest of the side seam, making sure the bottom of the garment and the end of the sleeve match up. Take your garment to your machine and sew. You will pivot the side seam once your needle reaches the armhole seam. Pin and sew the other side seam. Next, we will hem our garment. With your garment still inside out, take it to an ironing board and iron a 1 inch hem at the bottom of your garment and for each sleeve. Here, I am using a clear ruler as a guide to make sure I am maintaining an even 1 inch hem all the way along. I like to press one hem and then sew it before moving on to the next hem so it remains crisp. Starting the hem stitch in the side seam will hide any back stitching so it's less noticeable. Make sure the side seams are pressed open as you're sewing over them to avoid any bunching. To sew each hem, I like to first sew just past the 1/2 inch mark and then sew all the way around again at the 3/4 inch mark. This gives the illusion that a cover stitch machine has been used. Now, keep in mind whenever you use a straight stitch to sew a seam or a hem, it takes away any stretch the material might have. Because this is an oversized pattern, I personally do not see an issue with this. I had no problem getting the garment on and off. But of course, you can also use a twin needle attachment here, and it will maintain the stretch of the fabric that you're using. Finally, we are creating and attaching our neckband. take your neckband pattern piece and fold in half short ways with right sides together so the two shorter ends match up. Sew along the shorter ends. If not already, take your garment and turn inside out. Then take your neckband and fold over the long ways now so wrong sides are together. So the seam that we just sewed will be on the inside. We will still be matching the right side of the neckband to the right side of the shirt neckline. Insert the neckband into the garment so right sides are together and the raw edges are all facing the same direction. Match the seam you just sewed on the neckband with the middle back of the garment and pin. Now match the middle notch on the neckband to the middle front of the garment and pin. Evenly distribute the rest of the neckband between the two pins on each side of the garment and pin at the shoulder seam. Now the length of the back neckline is shorter than the length of the front neckline, so less fabric should be distributed on the back piece. Serge or zigzag stitch through all 3 layers, making sure that a 1/2 inch seam allowance is followed. Once you've completed, your garment is finished. All that's left is to turn it inside out and trim away any loose hanging threads that might have been left over from the seams you made earlier. If you have any questions or comments regarding the tutorial or the PDF instructions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me here or on my Etsy shop. I would be happy to answer any questions or just any concerns you might have.